Welcome to this explainer. Have you ever actually stopped and wondered just how far the government can legally go to fix our daily annoyances? Well, today we're unpacking a massive landmark Supreme Court case. It literally pit the government's desperate need to solve a huge traffic crisis right against the economic survival of everyday public utility bus drivers. We're looking at Supreme Court decision GR No. 194335. Now, this case asks some incredibly tough questions about the limits of government power, what a franchise actually is, and what happens when the public welfare just completely collides with private livelihood. Okay, let's just quickly check our legal docket for today. We're going to hit the heavy traffic dilemma, the number coding conflict, figure out exactly who makes the rules, dig into rights versus privileges, and finally, look at the Supreme Court's verdict. So, Part 1, the heavy traffic dilemma and the crisis on Metro Manila roads. Let's start with a real-world problem that, honestly, every commuter in Metro Manila knows way too well. I'm talking about the seemingly unsolvable, universally dreaded traffic congestion. This really sets the stage for us. The government was facing this absolutely crippling infrastructure issue, and they had to find ways to regulate road users just to ensure the safe and continuous flow of metro-wide services. I mean, we're talking about millions of people needing to move every single day. So traffic management wasn't just some nice convenience. It was a critical, literal necessity for the region's economy and safety. Now, this whole situation escalated quickly over a 14-year timeline. Back in 1996, the Metro Manila Development Authority, the MMDA, introduced the Unified Vehicular Volume Reduction Program. Now, most of us just call it the number coding scheme, right? Well, shortly after that rolled out, a memorandum of agreement was signed that gave public utility buses a partial exemption from the scheme. But fast forward to 2010, and the MMDA flat out revoked that exemption. Why? Well, because of recurring heavy traffic and just rampant traffic violations by bus drivers. And almost immediately, the affected bus drivers filed a lawsuit, which kicked off this entire constitutional battle. Which brings us to Part 2, the number coding conflict, where the bus drivers take on the administrative state. Okay, diving into the core conflict here, let's look at what the program actually entailed. The core restriction was incredibly simple, but man, it was devastating for operators. Under this program, vehicles with specific plate endings were completely banned from operating from 7 a.m. all the way to 7 p.m. on their designated days. So, for example, plates ending in 1 and 2 were banned on Mondays, 3 and 4 on Tuesdays, and so on. By revoking the bus exemption, public utility buses were suddenly yanked off the road for one entire day a week during peak hours. Just imagine losing a fifth of your weekly income overnight. That was the harsh new reality for these drivers. And that brings us to the human element. The bus drivers filed a petition directly to the Supreme Court. They argued that this rule unconstitutionally reduced their work hours, which obviously meant lower take-home pay, and that severely threatened their quality of life and their very livelihood. Plus, they claim this restriction basically acted as an amendment to their existing franchises, and it was done without due process. Basically, no proper notice, no prior hearing, just a sudden slash to their incomes. But before the Supreme Court could even listen to those arguments, they had to deal with a procedural hurdle. You see, usually there's this strict hierarchy of courts doctrine, which basically means cases have to start at the lower trial courts before they can climb all the way up to the Supreme Court. But the court actually made a rare exception here. They noted that issues of traffic management, government authority, and public welfare are of transcendental importance. Because this impacted literally millions of daily commuters and challenged the authority of a major constitutional body, the Supreme Court took the case directly. All right, Part 3, who makes the rules? Let's look at delegated power and some major jurisdictional clashes. So the drivers made a really big jurisdictional argument here. They claimed the MMDA stepped completely out of its lane, pun intended, and encroached on the powers of the LTFRB, the Land Transportation and Franchising Regulatory Board. The drivers argued that only the LTFRB actually has the power to regulate franchises. But the Supreme Court stepped in and clarified a supercritical distinction. Under Public Act No. 7924, the MMDA is specifically tasked with traffic regulation and road use in Metro Manila. Meanwhile, the LTFRB handles the granting and regulation of the franchises themselves. So banning a bus from the road on a specific day to ease traffic, that's a traffic regulation, not a franchise modification. Simply put, the MMDA is the traffic cop for the roads, and the LTFRB is the business licensor for the routes. This actually touches on a really fascinating area of law, the delegation of legislative power. Look, Congress simply cannot write every single daily rule required to run a complex modern society, right? So they delegate what's called subordinate legislation to administrative agencies. But to keep those agencies from having just unlimited, unchecked power, the Supreme Court uses two very strict tests. First up is the completeness test. This means the law must be complete in itself, setting out the exact policy to be executed. It can't just be a blank check. And second, the sufficient standard test. The law has to fix a clear standard that maps out the exact boundaries of the agency's power, so they don't overstep. So here's the crucial point. Through Republic Act number 7924, Congress actually met both of those tests. They explicitly delegated the authority to formulate policies, regulate the use of thoroughfares, and promote the safe movement of persons to the MMDA. Therefore, the MMDA absolutely possesses the valid delegated authority to issue binding traffic rules, like the number coding scheme, without having to run to Congress for a new, specific law every single time they want to adjust traffic rules. And this really matters because it confirms that administrative agencies, the bodies that manage our everyday civic lives, have real, binding authority without needing Congress to micromanage every single stoplight. Moving on to Part 4, Rights versus Privileges. Let's unpack the legal nature of a franchise. This brings us to a really fascinating educational pivot about the legal definition of what these drivers actually hold. The bus drivers argued vehemently that they were being stripped of their property rights, but that brings up a massive, massive legal question. Is a franchise actually a property right? Well, the law views this very, very differently than our everyday common sense might suggest. Here's how it works. When a bus operator wants to hit the road and serve the public, they are granted a Certificate of Public Convenience, or a CPC. Because the business of a common carrier is so deeply affected by public interest, it ceases to be strictly private property. The rule of thumb here is that if you voluntarily place your private property into public service, the law says you must submit to being controlled by the public for the common good. And the Supreme Court completely dropped the hammer with this exact precedent-setting quote. They said, "A certificate of public convenience constitutes neither a franchise nor a contract, confers no property right, and is a mere license or privilege." What does that mean in plain English? Basically, a certificate is granted by the state with major strings attached. It does not give the holder any vested property right over the public highways. Because it's merely a privilege granted by the state reserves the absolute right to impose new burdens, alter it, or even revoke it entirely when the public interest demands it. And finally, Part 5, the Supreme Court's verdict and putting public welfare first. Now, to address the driver's argument that they were denied due process because there was no prior hearing, the court made another really vital legal distinction. They contrasted rulemaking with quasi-judicial actions. Think of it this way. If an agency wants to revoke one specific individual's certificate for a past violation, that's a quasi-judicial act. Then yes, prior notice and a hearing are absolutely constitutionally required. But the number coding scheme, that's a general rulemaking action. It regulates the future conduct of an entire class of people. For general rulemaking, a prior hearing isn't actually required by due process, just as long as the rule is properly published. So ultimately, the Supreme Court completely dismissed the driver's petition. Now, the court did explicitly and sympathetically recognize the severe adverse effect on the driver's take-home pay and their livelihood. They knew it hurt. However, they ruled that the promotion of the general welfare, in this case alleviating a massive, suffocating traffic crisis, is of paramount importance. The law ultimately dictates that individual interests just have to be subordinated to the benefit of the greater number, provided the regulation is reasonably necessary and not unduly oppressive. And honestly, that's a pretty heavy thought to leave you with. In the face of a massive public crisis, where exactly should the line be drawn between government regulation and individual livelihood? The court's ruling here is crystal clear, but the human impact, that remains profound. It really just perfectly captures the enduring tension between our personal economic survival and the shared burdens we all have to accept for the greater public good. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this complex and fascinating case. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.